Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this video is all about the photo quality and features of the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, a full-frame mirrorless camera with 24 megapixels, improved subject recognition, uncropped 4K video up to 60p, and 40 frames per second bursts. I'll be making a separate video about the movie quality in the future, and I'll link to it here when it's ready. Announced in November 2022, the EOS R6 II arrives just over 2 years after the original model and is priced at about $2,500 or £2,780 for the body alone. Now, these are initial launch prices and the market has become very competitive, so do check the links below for the latest pricing and deals on both it and rival models. Here's the R6 II on the left alongside arguably its biggest rival, the Sony a7 IV on the right. Price-wise, the a7 IV has the benefit of being launched a whole year earlier, and that's allowed Sony to offer discounts and undercut Canon on price a little, although conversely, the extra year has allowed Canon to further refine its autofocus system, as I'll show you later in the review. A new arrival is Panasonic's Lumix S5 II, seen here on the right, launched a couple of months after the R6 II in January 23, but priced much cheaper at around $2,000 or pounds. As you'll see, the R6 II does outperform it in some regards, but in others they're remarkably close, and there are also some benefits to the S5 II that might make it a better choice overall for you. Now, I've already fully reviewed both the Sony a7 IV and Lumix S5 II, so if you want to find out everything that I know about either of those models, do check them out. But for this particular video, I've got hold of both rival models again in order to make a bunch of direct comparisons against the R6 II. So if you're looking for a full-frame hybrid camera, you've come to the right place. Oh, and since I'm not going to delay you with a sponsored segment in this video, please do consider giving it a like and my channel a follow if you find anything that I do here useful. It really does help. Thanks a lot. Okay, so here's the original R6 on the left and the new Mark II version which replaces it on the right. And at first glance, they do look pretty similar, sharing the same core design, build quality, and weather sealing. From the front, there's no longer an IR remote sensor on the Mark II grip, and from the rear, there's a mildly redesigned multi-controller joystick. So far so similar, but from the top, there's a few more obvious tweaks. First, the old power dial on the left is now used to switch between stills and video. So like the R7, this means the main mode dial can now be used to select the exposure mode for photo and video, rather than delving into menus for the latter. Secondly, the power control on the Mark II has been relocated to a new collar switch around the upper thumb wheel and now includes a position to also lock the wheel if desired. The Mark II mode dial now has extra positions for an auto movie mode, effects and scene presets, the latter also including a panorama option inherited from the R7. The camera also features Canon's latest multi-function shoe, sporting the additional pins to work with more sophisticated accessories as well as traditional flash guns. In terms of composition, the R6 II shares the same 3-inch 1.62 million dot screen as the R6, along with its side-hinged flip mechanism that can twist up and down, forward to face you, or back on itself for protection. The viewfinder is also the same as before, so you're getting a 3.69 million dot OLED panel with 0.76 times magnification that runs at 60 or 120 frames per second. In these respects, it's similar to the a7 IV and S5 II. Also inherited from the R6 are twin SD card slots supporting UHS 2 speeds, albeit not embracing anything faster like CF Express. Again, this is the same approach as the Lumix S5 II, and that makes the Sony a7 IV the only one of the three to support anything faster, in its case with a dual format top slot that can alternatively accommodate CF Express Type A cards for quicker flushing of the buffer after a burst. These cards are quite expensive though. The ports are the same as before, so you get 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, USB-C and micro HDMI, along with an E3 type remote terminal. Canon continues to infuriate videographers with micro HDMI versus the Sony a7 IV and Lumix S5 II, which both sport the much more robust full-size HDMI ports. The USB-C port can be used for charging and operation with a compatible power delivery source, and since the R6 II supports UVC, you can also use it as a standard webcam. I successfully charged and powered it with my MacBook Pro charger. Like most Canon bodies, the R6 II also supports wired or wireless tethering to a computer or smartphone as standard, a useful feature we often take for granted, but one that's not always broadly available on rivals. The The battery unsurprisingly remains the same, LPE6NH, although Canon now claims to squeeze slightly longer life out of it with 580 shots under SEPA conditions with the screen, or 320 with the viewfinder. If you'd like longer, the optional BG-R10 grip accommodates 2 batteries while also providing portrait controls. Like all Canon EOS R bodies, the R6 II employs the RF mount, allowing it to use Canon's growing range of native RF lenses, as well as adapting older EF DSLR models. But as most of you know, there's currently no third-party RF lenses with autofocus, and no news of that situation changing anytime soon. In stark contrast, Sigma's range of mirrorless lenses are already available for both Sony and Panasonic mirrorless cameras, while Sony owners additionally enjoy models from Tamron and more besides. Access to affordable third-party native lenses, often with innovative focal ranges or apertures, is a key advantage that Panasonic and especially Sony owners have over Canon, and if you're buying any EOS R camera, you'll need to factor in the price of Canon's own lenses into the equation. Now don't get me wrong, most of the RF lenses that I've tested are very good, but right now they are your only choice in the native mount, leaving adapted DSLR lenses as the only budget option. Behind the mount is a new sensor, boosting the photo resolution from 20 to 24 megapixels. While this only represents a mild upgrade and still falls short of the A7 IV's 33 megapixels, I do feel that it's become an easier figure to sell than the original model, especially to EOS R owners who understandably felt a little bit cheated, losing 10 megapixels when upgrading to a newer body. 24 megapixels or thereabouts has also become a standard across many cameras, including the Lumix S5 II, and it's certainly sufficient for most uses. I'll show you how these 3 rivals compare in pure resolving power in just a moment. But first, the image quality options. You can record RAW in standard or compressed formats, both at the full 24 megapixels, but the compressed version occupying roughly 2/3 the file size, while still giving you the flexibility of post-processing. Standard RAW files worked out around 30 megabytes each. Note the Sony A7 IV offers 3 different RAW compression options, while the Lumix S5 II lags behind with only 1. Meanwhile, JPEG shooters have the choice of 4 resolutions, 24, 11, 5.9 or 3.8 megapixels, with all but the smallest available with 2 different compression levels. Best quality large fine JPEGs measured around 9 megabytes each. Like the Sony A7 IV, but unlike the Lumix S5 II, you can alternatively set the camera to record 10-bit HIF files rather than JPEG if preferred. Under the aspect ratio menu, you can choose 3:2 in full frame or cropped formats, the latter applying the same 1.6 times field reduction as Canon's APS-C models, or use the full frame cropped to 1:1, 4:3 or 16:9. The Lumix S5 II takes a small lead here with a pair of panoramic crops, although the R6 II counters with actual panoramic mode. Next, to compare the technical resolution of the EOS R6 II, Lumix S5 II and Sony A7 IV, I photographed my standard resolution chart using the same adapted Sigma 40mm 1.4 art lens on each body. This is one of the sharpest lenses that I have, and as an EF model, it's possible to adapt it to multiple systems to place them on a level playing field optically. So here's the EOS R6 II on the left, the Lumix S5 II in the middle, both sharing the same 24 megapixel resolution, and the Sony A7 IV on the right with its 33 megapixels. At first glance, the Lumix S5 II in the middle looks the softest of the 3, but take a closer look and you'll notice some of Canon's advantage here is down to increased sharpening. That said, I'd say the R6 II is definitely squeezing a tad more detail from its sensor, but if you compare the points where they both fail to resolve the converging lines, it's actually closer than it first appears. Meanwhile, the A7 IV is out-resolving both rivals as you'd expect, although perhaps not by quite as much as you'd assume. We're really pixel peeping here to tell the difference. But remember, the S5 II has a pixel shifting trick up its sleeve, and switching its single frame result in the middle for one taken in its high resolution mode shows it taking a clear lead in potential resolving power. Once again, this is a tripod based only mode that works best with completely static subjects, like this test chart, but under the right conditions it does give the S5 II a resolution advantage over its rivals. To compare noise levels, I photographed this bunch of flowers, again with each of the 3 bodies fitted with the same adapted Sigma 40mm 1.4 art lens. I'm going to zoom in for a closer look before running through the full range of ISO sensitivities. Note the Lumix S5 II sensor employs dual native ISO, now with manual as well as auto switching for photo or video. I shot in RAW plus JPEG, but since the S5 II wasn't supported by Adobe at the time I made this review, you're looking at JPEGs out of camera in this comparison, where you can compare the relative approaches that each camera has for dealing with noise reduction and detail. Some companies prefer a noise-averse approach where all the speckles are smoothed out, albeit at the cost of smearing fine detail, whereas others prefer to leave some visible noise at high sensitivities to preserve detail. There's no right or wrong approach here, but let me know which is your preferred camera of the three at high ISOs. Personally, I'd say all three are looking pretty good up to 6400 ISO, but any higher and you'll steadily lose fine details to noise and smearing. I'd also say Panasonic's default approach may leave the most visible noise here, but not to the detriment of retained details. Just before moving on, I wanted to make one more high resolution mode comparison with the S5 II. So here's all three cameras back at their base sensitivities of 100 ISO before switching out the single 24 megapixel frame from the S5 II in the middle for its high resolution version. Look closely and you'll see finer detail in the petals and leaves in particular. I personally feel the high resolution mode on the S5 II, which combines 8 frames while subtly shifting the sensor between each, really does give it a resolution advantage, at least for those who can shoot in fairly controlled environments. It's a useful feature which so far Canon has neglected to implement on any camera that I've tested, and if you want it on a Sony, you'll need to spend more on the A7R series, and also make that composite using software afterwards. Moving on to dynamic range, here's a raw image I took of Brighton Pier with the R6 II, opened in Adobe Camera Raw, where you can see the sky is completely blown out. If you take a look at the histogram, you'll see there's clipping on those highlights. But if I reduce the exposure slider, those peaks gradually shift back into the histogram, revealing wispy clouds and colour in the sky. There's still some clipping on the water's surface, but if I slide the exposure down even further, some of that is retrieved, albeit not miraculously so. Reducing the exposure has of course now clipped my shadows, but a boost of the shadow slider and a tweak on the highlights brings a balanced overall result, with far more tonal detail than the original. Next for stabilization, with Canon now claiming the R6 II's sensor shift IBIS system can deliver up to 8 stops of compensation, at least with selected lenses, including some with no optical IS of their own. To show it in practice during composition, here's the view with the RF 24-105 f4L at 105mm, first with stabilization switched off, where the view is visibly wobbly, before switching it on via the lens and enjoying a much steadier view. Note the hand icon at the top with a plus symbol indicating that it is both sensor IBIS and optical IS working together for an enhanced result. In Canon's world, lenses with optical IS have a switch on their barrels which engages or disables both optical and sensor stabilization at the same time. There's no way to have one or the other. Here's a photo I took at 105mm using sensor and lens stabilization at 1/8 of a second, the slowest I could handhold with a perfectly sharp result, although the version at 1/4 of a second was also almost perfect. I'll keep this version on the left and now on the right show you how a shutter of 1/8 of a second looks for me without using any stabilization, where it's clearly ruined by camera shake. In fact, on the day I needed a shutter speed of 125th of a second for a sharp result without stabilization, and this in turn means the R6 II and 24-105 were giving me between 4 and 5 stops of compensation. Now that is better than the 3 stops that I've experienced with the Sony a7 IV, but not as good as the 6 stops that I enjoyed with the Lumix S5 II. Next for autofocus, one of the highlights of the EOS R6 Mark II, with the dual pixel system inheriting the deep learning algorithm of the EOS R3, and now adding horses to the animal detection menu, as well as vehicle recognition for aircraft and trains. Perhaps best of all though, a new auto option will try to detect the subject type for you, saving you from manually switching between people, animals and vehicles. Of course, in the case of multiple subject types on the same frame, you can still manually override, but for general use it could become your default option if it works. Let's find out. First, let's have a look at some of the options. In terms of autofocus area, the R6 II offers spot, single area, 2 expanded areas, 3 flexible zone options which can be customized, or the whole area where you leave it up to the camera to decide. Okay, so let's start with a single area test using the RF 24-105 at 105 f4, where you can see it pulling focus between the 2 bottles almost instantly. This is incredibly quick, although to be fair, this lens is a fast focuser and there are certainly some slower ones in the system, but a great first result nonetheless. But single autofocus with a single point in the middle is easy, so now here's the R6 II's human subject recognition in action with the full AF area selected. So this is the camera working out where I am on the frame, and I'm using the RF 24-105 f4L at 50mm f4. The camera spotted me immediately, and once the shutter was half pressed, it stayed locked on with a blue box throughout the clip. When my face is visible, the camera finds my nearest eye and easily sticks with me in full profile without skipping a beat. But what makes the R6 II better, or at least cleverer than the A7 IV and S5 II, is that it continues to recognise me as a human subject when I turn or walk away, tracking my head at close range and switching to my torso when more distant. Unlike its rivals, it never once loses subject recognition here. Let's try it again, but this time indoors in much dimmer conditions, where you can see the auto ISO now is up at around 2000. But as you can see, still no problem for the R6 II and RF 24-105 at 50mm f4, where the combination stays locked on me throughout, whether I'm in profile, turned away, or even on the other side of my room. So to see how the competition compares, I made a similar test with 50mm 1.8 lenses on the Canon EOS R6 II on the left and the Sony A7 IV on the right, both flanking the Lumix S5 II in the middle. Notice how both the EOS R6 II and A7 IV do a better job than the S5 II at staying locked onto my eye in full profile, but that the Canon is the only one of the three here that continues to identify the back of my head or torso as a human subject in this test when my face isn't visible. Sony's latest AF system in the A7R5 may roughly match Canon's R6 II performance here, but the older A7 IV falls roughly between it and the S5 II. But the R6 II isn't just confident when it comes to tracking humans. Here it is with animal selected in the subject menus, where it maintains eye detection on the dog throughout most of this clip. Unlike Sony, which separates animal and bird in the A7 IV menus, forcing you to choose between them, Canon and Panasonic group them together for easier deployment. As I move around the pigeon though, note how the R6 II stumbles and loses the eye for a bit, albeit still concentrating autofocus areas over the body. But wait, I've not been completely honest with you, as this isn't with the R6 II set to animal at all. It's been using the new auto subject detection during this entire clip, and while not 100% perfect, I'd say it's still doing a pretty good job. Manually selecting animal in the subject in the menus now allows the R6 II to narrow its algorithms to this type of subject and stay locked on the eye of the pigeon even under the conditions when it stumbled with the auto option. I was impressed with the auto setting though, so wondered how it would react to a more extreme test. So here I'll point the R6 II at people, where it successfully identified the closest and tracked their face. But now let's try a car, and as you'll see, it successfully places a box over vehicles driving towards or away from me. Remember, this is in auto subject detection, and that neither the A7 IV or S5 II even offer a manual option for vehicles. And back again to people, cyclists, people again, more cars, albeit sadly no birds or other animals in this clip. But you've already seen how well it dealt with that pigeon using auto mode in the earlier clip. For me personally, auto subject detection is the holy grail of autofocus algorithms, as while human, animal, bird and vehicle detection may be individually impressive, I don't want to have to always select between them in day-to-day use. Ideally, I'd like the camera to figure that out unless I tell it otherwise, and the R6 II is the first to do so successfully. Sure, if you're photographing portraits or events, well, human events anyway, I would manually select people as the subject type, as this will deliver quicker recognition and greater overall success rates. Likewise, if you're concentrating on, say, vehicles at a race or animals at a zoo, then do select them individually in the menus. But for general use, the auto setting works so well, I simply left the R6 II to its own devices and forgot all about it. This for me is a major upgrade, and the only thing that could make the R6 II's autofocus any better is if you could actually use your eye to select between multiple subjects on the frame, something, lest we forget, Canon can already do with higher end R3. I'm hoping the R3's tracking technology can be reduced in size and price and make it into all Canons going forward. Now let's see how it all works for action and bursts. As before, the fastest burst speed with the mechanical shutter remains 12 frames per second, but this is still faster than the A7 IV at 10 and almost double that of the S5 II at 7 frames per second when they're all using mechanical shutters with continuous autofocus. In my formal test, the R6 II seemed happy to keep shooting JPEGs at 12 frames per second for as long as I held the shutter down. I got bored after 21.5 seconds, during which it captured 256 large fine JPEGs, confirming that 12 frames per second speed, and with continuous servo AF as well. Set to RAW, I managed to capture 145 standard RAW files in 12.25 seconds, again confirming 12 frames per second. In this instance, the camera took roughly 10 seconds to fully clear the buffer afterwards, which is actually pretty quick considering it's using SD memory only. Here's a quick demo of the R6 II shooting at 12 frames per second using its mechanical shutter, where you can see I've fully captured the falling block in one frame and I've got lots to choose from during the splash. If you'd like to shoot faster bursts, switch the R6 II to its electronic shutter mode, where it can now shoot at an impressive 40 frames per second, double that of its predecessor, not to mention faster than the 30 frames per second of the S5 II, and especially the somewhat modest 10 frames per second of the A7 IV, when both of those cameras are using their electronic shutters. In my formal test, I managed to capture 136 large fine JPEGs in 3.4 seconds before the buffer filled, confirming the 40 frames per second top speed. Set to standard RAW, I managed 63 images in 1.65 seconds before it filled, again confirming 40 frames per second. In both cases, it took roughly 10 seconds to completely clear the buffer, again pretty fast for an SD card system. In comparison, my electronic burst on the Lumix S5 II lasted longer, for up to 200 frames in JPEG or RAW, but at a slightly slower speed of 30 frames per second. Note Sony's A7 IV won't go faster than 10 frames per second regardless of shutter type, and can actually slow down to 8 or even 6 frames per second if you're shooting certain RAW formats and if you're recording onto SD cards. So here's that splash test again with the R6 II, only this time using its 40 frames per second electronic shutter, where I now have 4 frames with the block falling and way more to choose from the resulting splash. Also note the R6 II electronic shutter supports speeds up to 16,000th of a second versus 8,000th of a second for the mechanical shutter. Okay, now let's see how it all works together for some basic action shots, starting with some approaching bikes using auto subject detection, the full auto-focusing area, and mechanical bursts of 12 frames per second. These were all taken with the RF24-105 f4L at 105 f4, so not particularly demanding, but the combination still worked well here. And now for some birds, and again the 24-105 isn't the best tool for this particular job, but I didn't have access to anything longer at the time of testing. I do hope to retest the R6 II with some longer telephotos, but given its predecessor was already excellent in this regard, and the autofocus has actually improved on the Mark II, I'm pretty confident it'll do well. One benefit of using a shorter focal length for testing recognition though was that the birds were very small on the frame, but the R6 II still managed to find their eyes and follow them around. Indeed, shooting side by side against the Lumix S5 II, the Canon felt more confident at identifying and tracking birds in flight, while also delivering much faster mechanical shutter bursts. The Sony A7 IV was also very good at bird detection, albeit only recognising eyes on non-humans, not heads and bodies on that particular generation. This is something that they've fixed on the A7R5. The R6 II also inherits the raw burst mode of the R7. This shoots at 30 frames per second, but has a pre-shot option which keeps a rolling buffer of the past half second's worth of shots as you keep the shutter half pressed. Once you fully push it down, this earlier half second is then committed to memory, followed by a short burst afterwards. Here's how it works in action. Notice the bar on the left-hand side indicating my buffer partly filling with pre-shot frames as I keep the shutter half pressed in anticipation. I then fully pushed the shutter down as the block hit the water, knowing I'd probably missed the initial contact, but also knowing that I already had half a second's worth of frames in the bag. You'll see the buffer bar fill in a few seconds before it turns red to indicate that it's now full. And here's the view in playback, starting with frame 16 of 142, which is the moment I pushed the shutter down. Like normal bursts, I can go forwards, but the clever part is also being able to go backwards to the moment before I fully push down on the shutter, where I have 16 frames of action representing half a second. Here it lets me find the moment the splash began, or even when the block was still in the air, before then letting you extract whichever frames you want as a JPEG, a HIF, or even a RAW file. The only downside to this mode is Canon stores them all in a single, somewhat hefty file, which you'll also need to navigate and extract during playback on the camera. but it's clear how useful it could be for capturing the moment, say, a bird takes flight or lands on a perch. There is, however, the usual big caveat whenever you use the electronic shutter, and that is potential skewing. Canon claims to have improved the sensor readout on the R6 II compared to the Mark I model, but it's still visible if your subject is moving quickly across the frame or when you're panning the camera quickly. To illustrate this, here's a pan taken with the R6 II at 70mm using the mechanical shutter, where the tower and buildings are vertically upright as you'd expect. But now here's the same pan taken with the electronic shutter, where the sensor readout speed has resulted in some skewing, with the tower and the buildings now leaning a little to the side. Note the frame intervals are smaller here due to the faster burst speed, but this doesn't affect the result. To be fair, these rolling shutter artifacts are actually roughly similar to those that I measured on the Lumix S5 II and Sony a7 IV, and all of them are a mild improvement over my original R6 in these tests, but equally all of them will show some skewing if the camera or subject are in fast motion. The only way to avoid, or at least minimize, rolling shutter when shooting electronically is to have a sensor with faster readout, such as the stacked sensors in models like the Canon EOS R3, but currently these are very expensive. If you can't stretch to a camera with a stacked sensor, be aware of the limitations of electronic shutters, or simply use the mechanical shutter instead. And that's why the R6 II has an advantage over its rivals, as it has the fastest mechanical shutter in its peer group. I should, however, mention the top burst speeds of 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 40 frames per second with the electronic are only supported in the R6 II's H+ mode, and that in turn is dependent on the lens you're using, plus you may need a decent amount of charge in your battery too. All RF lenses today are compatible, as well as a selection of adapted EF lenses, typically the most recent or updated versions. If you're interested, there's a full list in the supplemental information section at cam.start.canon, but I can't speak for adapted third-party EF lenses, so please let me know in the comments if you've tried any of them with the R6 II. Now, just before wrapping up, I wanted to mention some other photographic features. Like most Canon cameras, there's a bulb timer as standard, allowing you to easily dial in long exposures without the need for a cable release. A handy feature lacking from both the a7 IV and S5 II. The R6 II also has an interval timer, although won't go as far as to assemble them into a time-lapse movie afterwards, something that the Lumix S5 will do for you. There's a focus bracketing mode, like the Lumix S5 II, but sadly lacking from the Sony a7 IV. In fact, Sony has only just started adding this feature from the a7R5. But unlike the a7R5 and S5 II, the R6 II goes one step further with focus bracketing by inheriting the depth composite option of the R3 and R7, which can stack those images for you in camera, so no mucking around in software afterwards. Here's how it works in action, where you can choose the size of the burst and the focus increment between each frame. As always, you'll need to experiment with both in order to grab enough frames to cover your subject from the closest to the furthest. I found 80 frames with an increment of 10 worked fine for my coin shot with the RF 100mm macro lens here. Once you start the process, the R6 II gradually racks the lens focus automatically on each frame. Like the a7R5, Canon uses its electronic shutter during focus bracketing, where sensor readout won't be an issue, but it does mean that neither of those cameras can synchronize a flash at the same time. Now, this will be a limitation for some macro photographers who do actually use a flash on each frame. In its peer group, the Lumix S5 II is the only model that I've tested which can use its mechanical shutter during focus bracketing, at least internal focus bracketing, and that in turn allows the use of a flash. But the R6 II can stack a focus bracketed sequence in camera using its depth composite feature, and you're looking at the result here in playback. In contrast, both Sony and Lumix users will need to assemble their focus bracketed sequences in software later, like Helicon Focus. You can of course also do this with the Canon burst if you prefer more control over the process, but the depth composite option is really nice to have. And if you're into multiple exposure photography, the R6 II has you covered with an option that can not only combine 2 to 9 frames, but also lets you choose an existing image from your card as the first in the sequence. Not all cameras allow this. In fact, neither the a7 IV or S5 II offer multiple exposures at all. Which now brings me to my final verdict, where I'll share a selection of sample images taken with the EOS R6 II. As always, if you'd like a closer look at any of them, head over to my R6 II review page at cameralabs.com. The EOS R6 Mark II becomes one of the most powerful all-round cameras in its peer group. It's fair to say the original R6 was trumped in many respects by Sony's a7 IV, but now with the R6 Mark II, Canon's not only caught up, but overtaken Sony in a number of key respects. Most notably, the R6 II shoots much faster than the a7 IV while avoiding its various raw caveats. It sports broader and more confident subject recognition, at least in my tests, while its ability to film uncropped, oversampled 4K video up to 60p is a key advantage, and unlike the original R6, it never overheated in my tests, and also supports longer recording times. Plus you're getting focus bracketing and stacking in camera, bulb timers, multiple exposures, and slightly better stabilization than the Sony. Of all the upgrades, I think auto subject detection is arguably the most useful in day-to-day use, automatically figuring out if you're pointing the camera at people, birds, animals, or vehicles with a pretty high success rate in my tests. It's a fantastic setting for general use. Of course, it's not a completely one-sided race. Sony fights back with high-resolution files on the a7 IV and the ability to use a huge array of third-party lenses, including models from Sigma and Tamron. Then there's the Lumix S5 II, which offers a pixel shift high-res mode to boost detail on static subjects, a wealth of video-centric features from open gate recording to waveform monitors, third-party lens support from Sigma, and a significant price saving over the Canon and Sony too. Indeed, body price and choice of native lenses are the two main issues facing the R6 II. At the time that I made this review, it was roughly similar in price to the a7 IV in North America, and in terms of the body alone, I personally preferred it to the Sony. Plus, if you're a wildlife or sports photographer, I felt the faster mechanical bursts, pre-capture option, and more assured subject detection made it worth spending the extra over the S5 II. But in other markets, it's quite a bit more expensive than its rivals. In the UK, for example, you're looking at £2,780 for the R6 II body at launch versus £2,400 for the a7 IV, and just £2,000 for the S5 II, or indeed the newly discounted original R6. And that makes the new version less of a slam dunk and something you will have to weigh up carefully. And regardless where you buy your camera, everyone will need to consider the thorny issue of native third-party lens support, something currently unavailable for EOS R owners. Sure, you can still adapt a wealth of EF DSLR lenses, but if you want native models for the best experience, you're currently limited to Canon's own RF series. Once again, don't get me wrong, there's some excellent performers in there, but it's far from a complete range as yet, and the better models are quite expensive. Ultimately, the R6 II, a7 IV and S5 II are all excellent cameras most of us would be delighted to own. Choosing one over the other involves weighing up body price, lens availability, and drilling down to very specific features that you may or may not need. If your budget will stretch and you're happy to use Canon's own lenses, I can highly recommend the R6 II as an all-rounder, and especially so for anyone photographing sports or wildlife. But if you're more of a general shooter or not wedded to Canon, do compare it closely to rivals. And that's it for another in-depth review, and as always, bonus points if you got to the end without skipping. I'd love to hear what you think of the Canon R6 II in the comments, and if you found any of this video useful, please do consider giving it a like and my channel a follow, which only leaves me to try and sell you a Camera Labs t-shirt, hustle for a cup of coffee, or tempt you with my in-camera photography book. Go on, you know you want it. Links for everything, including the latest R6 II prices below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.